Most organizations approach AI adoption the same way they approach everything else in Microsoft 365, as a procurement problem. You identify a business need, you find a product that addresses it. You buy seats, deploy it to a pilot group, measure some adoption metrics, and if the numbers look reasonable, you declare success and roll it out broadly. It feels like progress. It looks like progress. Your executives get to announce an innovation initiative. Your IT team gets to check a box. Your users get access to shiny new AI features. But here's what the data actually shows. 95% of enterprise AI pilots fail to deliver measurable business impact. Not because the technology is broken, not because the models aren't smart enough, not because your users don't like it. They fail because the operating model you're running those pilots inside is fundamentally misaligned with how AI actually works. That's the insight I want to walk you through today. And I'm going to ground it in something concrete. A simulation of 100 companies implementing AI in Microsoft 365 environments. Not a survey, not a case study collection, an actual computational model where I created synthetic company personas, ran them through AI adoption scenarios, and watched where they predictably broke. What emerged was striking. The failures weren't random. They weren't outliers. They were consistent, repeatable, structural patterns. Every single simulation hit the same walls at roughly the same adoption percentages. The same decisions led to the same outcomes. Same governance assumptions led to the same cascading failures. Here's what most organizations get wrong about governance. They think it's about policies and documentation. You write a data classification standard. You create a DLP policy. You publish a sensitivity label schema. You document retention rules. You check the boxes. You think you've governed your environment. But governance isn't a document. It's a behavioral system. It's the set of constraints, incentives, and feedback loops that shape how people actually work inside your organization. And here's where it gets critical. AI agents expose every weakness in that system instantly. A user who informally shared a file with someone outside the company used to be a small event. You might never notice. The damage stayed small. But when you introduce AI, that oversharing becomes operational. A co-pilot indexes that document. A colleague asks a question. The AI surfaces an answer that reveals proprietary information to someone who shouldn't see it. Now you have an incident. Now you have a compliance violation. That's not an AI problem. That's a governance problem that AI amplified. The simulation I built tracked 100 different company models, each with their own governance structure, identity architecture, collaboration patterns, and automation practices. I ran them through AI adoption scenarios and watched what happened. The first pattern broke immediately. The second pattern held longer but failed predictably. By pattern 5, I could tell you exactly when the organization would hit a wall. And there's something almost unsettling about the consistency. It's not like some organizations solved it and others didn't based on luck or leadership quality. It's structural. It's mathematical. Organizations that approached governance one way reached 70% adoption and saw measurable ROI. Organizations that approached it another way stalled at 20 to 30% and watched their AI investment turn into waste. What this episode does is walk through those 5 failure patterns. I'll show you where every single simulation broke. I'll explain why those breaks happened at predictable points. I'll tell you exactly what the successful simulations did differently. And critically, I'll give you a framework you can use to assess your own organization's readiness. But here's the most important thing to understand up front. This is not a technology problem. It's not something you solve by buying better tools or hiring more consultants or running another pilot. This is a model problem. You're running a distributed self-service system, Microsoft 365, with a centralized, control-focused governance model. That mismatch is structural. It's built into how your organization makes decisions. And every AI capability you add amplifies that mismatch until something breaks. The good news is that the fix is knowable. It's not mysterious. It's not expensive. It's about sequence, discipline, and clarity. It's about treating governance not as a constraint on innovation, but as the foundation that makes innovation possible. The question isn't whether you can fix this. You can. The question is whether you'll start before you scale your AI adoption, because everything after this point depends on that choice. Let me show you what I found in those 100 simulations. The simulation, what I built and why. To understand those failure patterns, I need to walk you through how I built this simulation and why that methodology matters. I started with a straightforward question. If I could create a synthetic population of organizations, run them through AI adoption scenarios, and watch what breaks, what patterns would emerge, not through interviews or surveys where people tell you what they think happens, not through case studies where successful organizations describe what they did right, but through actual computational simulation where the dynamics play out in real time across hundreds of iterations. Here's what I built. I used Azure AI Foundry to create 100 distinct company personas. Each one had a realistic governance structure, an identity architecture, a collaboration footprint, and automation practices. Some had strong identity hygiene. Some didn't. Some had clear data classification schemes. Others had sensitivity labels scattered across their tenant with no enforcement. Some had architecture teams making deliberate decisions. Others had sprawl that accumulated organically over years. The point wasn't to model companies that all looked the same. It was to create variation that matched what you actually see in the real world. Small companies, Large enterprises, organizations that treated governance seriously, organizations that treated it as an afterthought. Financial services firms where compliance pressure forced rigor. SaaS companies that moved fast and loose. Then I added the knowledge layer. I built a knowledge graph using GraphRAG, a structured way to represent not just data, but the relationships between identities, permissions, policies, and access patterns. This matters because the failures I was hunting for don't happen in isolation. They compound. Identity sprawl creates collaboration sprawl, which creates automation risk, which creates compliance gaps. The knowledge graph let me track those propagations. Here's where it got interesting. I didn't just create static models, I built multi-agent simulations where different personas inside each organization interacted with each other. A CISO agent that cared about security and compliance, an IT architect agent that cared about system reliability and support costs, business unit agents that cared about speed and productivity. These agents made decisions about access, about sharing, about which controls to implement or circumvent. They negotiated trade-offs. They lived with consequences. When AI adoption happened in the simulation, these agents had to adapt. They faced new decisions. What policies apply to Copilot? How do you govern AI agents calling automations? What happens when an AI system surfaces access patterns nobody was aware of? The agents responded the way real people do. They sometimes made coherent decisions, sometimes they made contradictory ones, sometimes they solved a problem locally in a way that created a bigger problem globally. I ran this simulation at scale, not just once, not even 100 times. I ran 1,000 plus iterations across the 100 company models, introducing variations in governance approach, leadership clarity, technical enforcement, and adoption speed. Each iteration told me this decision led to this outcome at this stage of adoption. The output wasn't a report full of recommendations. Those exist everywhere and most organizations ignore them anyway. What I built was a behavioral map. For each type of governance approach, I could show you, this is where you hit the wall. This is the adoption percentage where trust collapses. This is the timeline until you hit a compliance crisis. This is what separates organizations that recover from those that spiral into a governance lockdown. That behavioral map is what we're going to walk through now. Because here's what matters. The patterns held across all the variation, different industries, different company sizes, different starting points. They all hit the same failure modes at predictable moments. That's not random, that's structural. Failure pattern 1, identity blind spots. Let's start with where every simulation broke first. Not eventually, not after months of adoption. Right at the beginning, when the first serious stress test hit the governance model, the question was simple. I asked each simulated organization, who has access to what? Not in theory, in reality. Can you enumerate it? Can you defend it? Can you explain why this user has this level of access to this resource? In every single simulation, the answer was the same. Nobody knew, not completely. The CISO agent could tell you who has access to the most critical systems. The IT architect could tell you what the intended state should be. The business unit leaders could tell you who they've invited to specific projects. But nobody could answer the question comprehensively because identity governance was fragmented. IT owned user accounts, security owned group membership and privileged access. Business units owned workspace creation and sharing decisions. Compliance had retention policies, but not access policies. It's not that these organizations were incompetent, it's that the responsibility was distributed in a way that guaranteed nobody owned the outcome. Here's where it got operational. When you introduce AI, you don't introduce a way to bypass these permissions. That's important to understand. Copilot doesn't crack open locked resources. It doesn't find secret files. It surfaces what's already accessible, but it surfaces it at conversational speed. A user asks a question. The AI retrieves documents from teams they forgot they were members of. It pulls email from distribution lists they inherited years ago. It surfaces spreadsheets from abandoned projects with open permissions. The user discovers they can access things they shouldn't be able to. That discovery cascades. If I can access finance data from a project I'm no longer on, what else can I access? Who else can access things they shouldn't? When you run this discovery at scale across an organization, trust breaks fast. The simulation showed this with precision. Organizations that had identity blind spots hit a hard wall at 30% adoption. That's where users started discovering access they didn't expect, where managers started asking why their reports could see documents from other departments, where security teams started getting alarms about unusual data access patterns. The incident rate spiked. Incidents required investigation. Investigations revealed that access controls were more permissive than anyone realized. By the time the organization tried to clean it up, they'd already lost user confidence. They'd also learned that restricting access would break workflows people depended on. The organizations that solved this before scaling AI did one thing differently. They didn't just document what the ideal state should be. They treated identity governance as a line item with ownership and consequence. Someone owned the cleanup. Someone ran quarterly access reviews that actually resulted in removing access, not just documenting findings. Someone categorized every identity, users, guests, service principals, applications with OAuth grants, and assigned clear ownership for each one. When that happened, something shifted. Organizations that did the hard work of identity cleanup before introducing AI reached 60 to 70% adoption. They got there because they weren't fighting a constant battle against unexpected access patterns. They also built institutional muscle for the other governance decisions that came later. Organizations that didn't do this work stayed stuck at 15 to 20% adoption. They deployed AI into a permission structure they didn't fully understand. When problems emerged, fixing them meant either breaking workflows or living with risk. They chose to restrict, and adoption flatlined. The critical detail: the simulation showed that this wasn't a tool problem. Better permission management software didn't solve it. Advanced analytics didn't solve it. The organizations that succeeded treated service principals and AI agents as first-class security principles. They put them through the same access reviews. They assigned explicit ownership. They ran quarterly recertification just like they did for humans. It sounds boring. That's partly why so many organizations skip it. But boring governance scaled. Sophisticated governance that wasn't actually enforced didn't. That's pattern 1. Let's look at what happened next. Failure pattern 2, collaboration sprawl without lifecycle. The second pattern emerges from a feature, not a flaw. Microsoft 365 gives every user the ability to create a team, provision a SharePoint site, spin up a group, start a planner project. It's empowering. It removes friction. It lets work happen at the speed people need. The problem is what happens after the creation. In the simulation, I watched this unfold across every organization type. Someone starts a project, they create a workspace. Teammates join, work happens, the project completes. Or it doesn't, it just gets abandoned. Either way, the workspace sits there, nobody deletes it. The company never had a policy to delete it. The owner moves to another role or leaves the company. Nobody recertifies ownership. The workspace is now a ghost, technically still accessible, still holding data, still consuming infrastructure, but orphaned. Fast forward 2 years, the average simulated organization had accumulated thousands of these abandoned workspaces. Not tens, not hundreds, thousands. Each one held documents. Some of those documents were sensitive, some were outdated policies that contradicted current standards, some were just forgotten work in progress that nobody needed anymore. That's where it stayed until AI arrived. Then something shifted. When Copilot was introduced, it indexed the entire tenant, all those abandoned teams, all those archived projects, all those workspaces whose owners had moved on. Users started asking questions. Show me everything related to the Azure migration project. The AI returned documents from 3 different projects spread across 4 years, including one where the owner had been laid off 18 months ago and nobody had thought to remove access. Users discovered they could access documents from cancelled initiatives. They surfaced files from teams they'd never intentionally joined, but had been added to by group membership they didn't track. Here's where the cascade started. One incident becomes awareness. Awareness becomes questions. Questions become audits. By month 6 of AI adoption in the simulation, organizations without workspace lifecycle policies were getting buried. Audit findings spiked. Security was investigating unusual access patterns that weren't actually unusual, they were just finally visible. Incident response teams were overwhelmed. Management was demanding answers about data exposure. The pattern was depressingly predictable. Proliferation of workspaces, abandonment because nobody cleaned them up, AI exposure because indexing made them operational again, incident because sensitive data surfaced unexpectedly, over-restriction as an overcorrection, productivity collapse because now it takes 6 weeks to get approvals for a new workspace. Organizations caught in this cycle had to choose. Keep the system open and accept the risk, lock it down and kill productivity. Either way, AI adoption stalled because neither option was sustainable. The organizations that broke this pattern did something different. They didn't just write a policy saying workspaces expire after 2 years. They automated it. They built standard templates for Teams and SharePoint sites that enforced naming conventions, applied sensitivity labels from day one, and set retention policies before the first file was ever uploaded. They required every workspace to have a designated owner. They set expiration dates on workspaces and made owners recertify ownership quarterly, not as a one-time project, but as an ongoing operational requirement. More critically, they made the cleanup automatic. Workspaces with no recertified owner were archived, not deleted, archived. That distinction matters because it preserved the data if someone needed it later, but it removed it from active availability. When organizations implemented this before scaling AI, something concrete changed. Time to value was 40% faster because teams weren't debating who owns what workspace. Security incidents dropped by 60% because the abandoned workspace attack surface had been reduced. More importantly, the organization could actually scale AI adoption because the data foundation was clean. The difference between pattern 1 and pattern 2 is this. Pattern 1 was about discovery. You had to find out what access existed. Pattern 2 was about management. You had to prevent sprawl from accumulating in the first place. Both required treating governance as a system, not a side effect. Failure pattern 3. Automation without governance, the unregulated runtime. We're now at a layer deeper than access control or workspace management. This is about the hidden operational backbone that most organizations don't even inventory. Every organization in the simulation had automations scattered across their environment. Power Automate flows, logic apps, custom integrations. Some were built by IT. Most were built by business units who needed to move data between systems and didn't want to wait for IT to build a proper integration. These automations weren't toys. They were doing real work, moving money between accounts, updating HR records, triggering procurement workflows, sending compliance notifications, running scheduled jobs that other processes depended on. Here's the critical part. Most of these automations lived in what Microsoft calls the default environment. There was no separation between experimental flows and production workflows. No change control, no testing, no monitoring, no clear ownership. Someone in finance built a flow to pull data from the ERP system and update a spreadsheet used by the CFO. That person got promoted. 6 months later, they left the company. Nobody documented the flow. Nobody knew who owned it. Nobody tested what would happen if the ERP system returned an unexpected data format. When the simulation introduced AI agents, everything changed. AI agents need tools to do their work. A co-pilot or an AI-driven automation needs to call business systems. One of the natural tools available is exactly what you already built, those Power Automate flows and logic apps. An agent can invoke them just like a human could, except the agent won't know that the flow was built by someone who left the company. The agent won't know that the flow has never been properly tested under load. The agent won't know that it's been quietly failing for months and everyone's just been accepting bad data as normal. The failure mode became operationally visible immediately. An AI agent calls a flow with input it hadn't seen before. The flow logic breaks on that unexpected input. The flow fails, but it fails silently. No alert, no monitoring. The downstream process that depends on that flow's output stops working. Reconciliation breaks, reporting breaks, workflow breaks. Hours of troubleshooting later, someone discovers the real problem. By then, cascading failures have rippled through multiple systems. The simulation revealed something unsettling about automation inventory. 70% of organizations had at least one piece of critical path automation that was owned by someone who had left the company, documented nowhere, and would break under load. Not 20%, 70%. These weren't edge cases, they were normal. When AI adoption scaled, these became ticking time bombs. Every critical process that depended on an undocumented automation was a single point of failure waiting to trigger cascading failures. An agent calls a flow. The flow breaks, a dependent process fails, alert fatigue sets in. The organization stops trusting automation. They start rebuilding things manually. Productivity collapses. The organizations that dodged this pattern treated automation differently. They didn't pretend that flows were just casual integrations. They treated automation as production code. That meant separate environments: dev, test, production. Not everything in the default environment. It meant change control. Every automation change had to go through review and testing before it went live. It meant monitoring. They tracked execution times, failure rates, and unexpected inputs. Most critically, it meant ownership. Every automation had a documented owner, and that ownership was part of someone's actual job responsibilities, not a ghost dependency they inherited and forgot about. Organizations that implemented this saw 50% fewer incidents related to automation failure. More importantly, when they scaled AI adoption, they could confidently give agents access to those flows because they'd already proven they were reliable. Agents became tools for orchestrating work, not landmines waiting to detonate. The difference between organizations that succeeded and those that stalled came down to one thing. Were you treating your automation layer as infrastructure or as a side effect? The ones that chose infrastructure scaled AI adoption without operational chaos. The ones that chose side effects watched their automation-dependent processes fail under AI-driven load. Failure pattern 4. Ownership and accountability gaps. Conditional chaos. In every simulation, there was a moment when something broke and the organization had to decide what to do about it. Maybe it was an unexpected access pattern. Maybe it was an automation failure. Maybe it was a compliance finding. The moment the question got asked, who owns this? Who decides how to fix it? The organization hit a wall. And here's where it got interesting. The answer was never simple. The T said it was a business problem. Security said it was an IT problem. Business units said they were just users and shouldn't be held responsible for governance decisions. Compliance said it needed policy, but policy wasn't their job. Nobody was accountable for the outcome because responsibility was distributed in a way that guaranteed diffusion. This created what I call conditional chaos. Each team was optimizing locally for their own constraints. It wanted to move fast and enable self-service because that reduced support overhead. Security wanted strong controls because that reduced breach risk. Business units wanted autonomy because that meant they weren't bottlenecked waiting for approvals. None of these objectives are wrong. The problem is they're contradictory. One team enables external sharing to move fast. Another team locks it down for security. Neither knows about the other's decision. They're both pursuing legitimate objectives in ways that create global contradictions. In a normal environment, these contradictions stay local. The teams figure it out through tribal knowledge or escalation. It's slow, it's frustrating, but it doesn't break the system. When you introduce AI agents, everything changes. An agent following one team's sharing policy will violate another team's security posture. An agent calling an automation that was built under one set of assumptions will hit constraints it didn't expect. An agent trying to optimize for speed will surface data that another team considers confidential. The agent isn't behaving badly, it's just following the contradictory rules the organization handed it. The simulation showed this clearly. Organizations without a clear AI governance owner hit a decision bottleneck around month 3 of adoption. Every change required alignment across 5 or more stakeholders. IT couldn't move forward without security approval. Security couldn't approve without compliance input. Compliance needed business justification. Business units were busy with actual work. Nothing moved. The organization's adoption curve flatlined. Pilots extended, rollout dates slipped. By month 6, momentum was dead. The teams weren't lazy, they weren't incompetent, they were stuck in a system where distributed decision-making looked good in theory, but produced gridlock in practice. The organizations that broke free of this pattern did one structural thing differently. They assigned clear, singular accountability for AI governance. That didn't mean one person did all the work. It meant one person had the authority to make trade-off decisions and enforce consequences. This person or small team owned policy direction. They had a mandate to say, we're doing this, and move forward, knowing that reversing a decision was possible but not the default. More critically, they made that accountability visible. Everyone knew who owned AI governance. Teams knew where decisions came from. Conflicts got escalated to one clear place, not debated across 5 siloed organizations. When organizations structured accountability this way, adoption accelerated. Teams could move because they had a clear decision maker. Conflicts still happened, but they got resolved instead of debated forever. Organizations with clear governance ownership reached 70% adoption and saw measurable ROI. Those without clear ownership stayed stuck at pilot phase. The difference wasn't money or tools or effort, it was structural. One approach gave you decision velocity, the other approach gave you consensus seeking that never converged. The simulation showed that governance ownership was the single biggest predictor of AI adoption success. More important than budget, more important than skill, more important than tools. You could have everything else right and still fail if accountability was diffuse. You could be under-resourced and still succeed if accountability was clear. That's pattern 4. The next one is about something that looked like success but was actually theater. Failure pattern 5, compliance theater, controls that exist only on paper. The 5th pattern is the most insidious because it masquerades as success. If you walked into an organization's compliance office, you'd see evidence everywhere. Data classification policies, data loss prevention rules, retention schedules, sensitivity label schemas. On paper, governance looked bulletproof. They'd done the work. They'd documented the standards. They'd created the frameworks. The binders were full. But the policies existed in one place and the actual controls existed in another, and they almost never lined up. A sensitivity label schema was published, but only half the organization knew it existed. Labels were created, but not actually applied to documents. Retention policies were written down but never deployed to the tenant. DLP rules were configured, but nobody was monitoring whether they actually fired. This disconnect had a name: compliance theater, the appearance of control without the substance of enforcement. For years this worked fine. Auditors would come in. They'd review the policies, they'd see the documentation, they'd check the box and move on. Everyone was satisfied because everyone was pretending the gap between policy and reality didn't matter. Then AI arrived and the gap became operational. When you introduce a system that can surface content across your entire tenant at scale, that gap stops being theoretical. Copilot doesn't care that you have a data classification policy. It reads documents that were never actually labeled. It retrieves files from across your organization and assembles answers that would have violated your DLP policy if anyone was actually monitoring DLP. It surfaces content that should be under legal hold because retention policies were never actually enforced. All of this happens at conversational speed, and none of it triggers the controls you wrote down years ago. This is where auditors start asking harder questions. Not, do you have a DLP policy? But how do you know this control actually works? Can you show me evidence that sensitive data is being prevented from leaving the organization? The silence in that room is deafening because the honest answer is, we don't know. We wrote the policy. We configured the tool. But we're not actually monitoring it. The simulation showed that organizations running on compliance theater hit an audit crisis around month 9 of AI adoption. Regulators or internal auditors would start asking for control evidence. They'd run tests. They'd ask Copilot a question designed to surface sensitive data and watch as it returned exactly what they were testing for. The organization would realize that none of their controls were actually in the operational path. The policies existed, the controls existed, but they'd never been connected. What happened next varied. Some organizations panicked and shut everything down. Others doubled down on documentation, writing even more policies that they wouldn't enforce. A few actually fixed the problem. The fix required a complete inversion of how organizations thought about governance. Instead of policy first and hoping technical controls would follow, organizations had to start with automation and monitoring. A sensitivity label wasn't done being created when someone published the schema. It was done when labels were being automatically applied to documents based on content analysis. A DLP policy wasn't done being configured when someone wrote the rule. It was done when someone was continuously monitoring whether the rule was firing and responding to violations. A retention policy wasn't complete when it was written. It was complete when retention was actually executing and evidence was being automatically collected to prove it. This meant real investment in the technical layer. It meant continuous monitoring instead of point-in-time audits. It meant building feedback loops so that when a control failed, someone knew about it immediately instead of discovering it months later during an audit. Organizations that made this shift passed their audits and scaled AI adoption without regulatory friction. More importantly, they built confidence that their controls actually worked. They knew their governance was real because they could demonstrate it with automated evidence. The difference between compliance theater and real compliance was simple. One existed only when someone was watching. The other was continuous and automatic. That's pattern 5. These 5 patterns repeat across every organization that tries to scale AI without addressing structural governance gaps. But there's a deeper reason why they keep happening. Why these patterns are structural, not accidental. Here's what strikes me about these 5 failure modes. None of them are unique to AI adoption. They exist in every Microsoft 365 environment. They're inherent to how the system is designed and how most organizations operate inside it. The fundamental mismatch is architectural. Microsoft 365 is built for distributed, user-driven collaboration. Self-service is the operating principle. Users create teams, users provision sites, users build automations, users decide who to share with. The system assumes organizations will manage the consequences at scale, and most organizations fundamentally cannot. Before AI existed, this mismatch stayed invisible. A user inherited access to something they shouldn't via a group membership they didn't remember joining. But they didn't accidentally surface that access to anyone important. It was just sitting there, invisible, until someone asked about it directly. An abandoned team held sensitive data with open permissions, but nobody indexed it and brought it to light through a conversational query. An automation built in the default environment failed silently, but only 3 people noticed, and they just worked around the problem instead of escalating it. Oversharing was rampant, but discovery was slow and friction-filled. You had to know what you were looking for to find it. AI changes this equation entirely. It collapses friction. A co-pilot doesn't know that a document was shared ad hoc by someone who left the company. It just knows the document exists and someone has permission to it. It surfaces it. An AI agent doesn't understand the provenance of an automation or the original intent behind its business logic. It just calls it and passes whatever data the agent thinks is appropriate. The system returns what it was built to return, for better or worse. The agent might orchestrate 5 automations in sequence and trigger cascading failures that ripple through your organization in ways nobody predicted because the automations were never built to be chained. The simulation revealed something crucial. Organizations aren't failing because their leaders are incompetent or their teams are lazy. They're failing because they're running a distributed system with a centralized governance model. That's a structural contradiction. You can't reconcile it through better policy documents or more frequent meetings. You can only resolve it by changing the model itself. Microsoft 365 says to users, create what you need. The same organization says, but governance is the responsibility of a centralized IT team that approves everything. Users win this argument by ignoring the central team and creating anyway. Governance loses by default. It's not that governance is poorly enforced. It's that governance is fighting the architecture of the system it's trying to govern. When you add AI on top of that contradiction, everything accelerates. Instead of one user discovering overshared content through search, a slow, friction-filled process, 100 users get answers from it via Copilot in a single day. Instead of one automation failing silently and 3 people working around it, an agent orchestrates 50 automations and cascading failures ripple through procurement, finance, HR, and operations simultaneously. The hidden problem becomes operational. The invisible debt becomes a visible crisis. The structural fix requires a fundamental shift. You move from governance as policy, documents that describe the ideal state, to governance as guardrails, technical and process constraints built into the system itself. Instead of trying to control everything centrally and hoping people follow the policy, you build constraints that make the wrong choice harder than the right choice. This is why the simulation showed such a stark difference. Organizations with automated lifecycle enforcement on workspaces, where labels were applied automatically based on content, where automation environments were enforced by policy and not just suggestion, where access reviews were continuous and tied to actual permission removal, these organizations scaled AI adoption 3 times faster than those relying on published policies and manual reviews. The difference wasn't money or effort or tool sophistication. It was whether governance was a rule people followed or an architecture people lived inside. The Identity Readiness Framework, Part 1, Inventory and Cleanup. So what does fixing this actually look like? This is where the frameworks come in. They're not theoretical. They're a sequence of concrete things you can do, measured against what the simulation revealed about what works. Start with identity. Not because it's the most important, they're all foundational, but because everything else depends on it. You cannot have clean data governance if you don't know who has access to the data. You cannot scale automation safely if you don't know which identities can invoke it. You cannot build a collaboration model that works if you don't understand the permission topology underneath it. The first step in identity readiness is brutal honesty about what you actually have. Open your Entra ID and enumerate everything. Not what you think you have, what you actually have. Users, guests, service principals, managed identities, applications with OAuth grants, delegated permissions, every identity that can authenticate and request access to a resource. When organizations do this exercise, they discover something unsettling. They have 30 to 50% more identities than they thought they had. Stale guest accounts from projects that ended 2 years ago. Service principals created by developers for integrations that no longer exist. Applications with consent, grants that nobody remembers approving. Former contractors whose accounts were disabled but never removed. Consultants who finished engagements months ago but still have active credentials. The organizational structure is clean on paper. The identity layer is a mess. This isn't a sign of failure. It's normal. Microsoft 365 makes it easy to add identities. It makes it hard to remove them because nobody wants to risk breaking something that depends on an account they don't fully understand. So accounts accumulate. The simulation showed that organizations that didn't clean this up first hit adoption walls around 40% usage. Users started discovering they could access things they shouldn't. Managers started asking why their reports could see financial data from divisions they never worked in. Auditors started asking whether access was actually least privilege or just accumulated inertia. Trust broke down. Adoption stalled. The cleanup process is mechanical but necessary. Remove guest accounts that no longer have a business justification. Revoke OAuth grants from applications that are no longer in use. Consolidate service principals that are doing the same job. Make sure every single identity has a documented owner and a business justification, not a vague statement like used for integrations. Specific. This service principal authenticates our ERP integration flow in the finance automation suite. Use Azure AD Access Reviews to formalize this. Don't make it a one-time project. Make it quarterly. Make it non-optional. Track remediation. When a review finds an identity that shouldn't have access, actually remove it. Don't document it and move on. That's compliance theater. Actual access removal is what signals that governance has teeth. Run it for every critical resource class, users and their group memberships, guest accounts and their assigned roles, service principals and their API permissions, delegated admin permissions, anything that can act on behalf of a user or access a resource. More importantly, make access reviews a regular business process, not an IT project. Assign ownership of each review to a business stakeholder, a manager who knows why people need what access. Make the review their job quarterly, not an optional thing IT sends them. When a manager sees that they're accountable for access decisions, they take it more seriously. Organizations that completed cleanup before scaling AI reached 60 to 70% adoption. The ones that skipped it and hoped to catch problems later stayed at 15 to 20%. The difference wasn't strategy or skill. It was whether they invested 6 to 8 weeks upfront cleaning the foundation before building on it. This is foundational. Without it, every other governance control is built on sand. You're trying to implement least privilege on top of unknown privilege. You're trying to scope automations while permission paths are undocumented. You're trying to classify data for access control when you don't actually know who has access to it. None of that works. You have to start here. The Identity Readiness Framework. Part 2. Least privilege going forward. Cleanup gets you to a known state, but the moment you finish the cleanup project, the clock starts over. New employees arrive. New integrations get built. Service accounts get created for applications. Guest accounts get invited for partnerships. The entropy starts accumulating again. The question becomes, what changes to prevent this from happening again? The second part of identity readiness is about changing the creation process itself. Every new identity that enters your organization should follow a single principle. Start with 0 permissions, not 0 initial permissions that get assigned later. 0 permissions that stay 0 until there's a documented business reason to grant access. This sounds simple. It's not. It requires discipline at multiple levels. When a new employee joins, IT has automation that provisions an account, but that account only works for basic services: email, basic SharePoint access, network access. No group memberships, no elevated permissions, no delegated access to business systems. Those come through a request and approval process that happens separately, documented and tracked, so there's always a reason for the access that exists. When a developer needs a service account for an integration, they don't get a shared credential that works with broad permissions. They get a managed identity scoped to a specific application with permissions limited to exactly what that application needs to function. Nothing more. If the application later needs broader access, that's a change that goes through review. The simulation showed a clear correlation. Organizations that implemented zero-trust identity policies, where new identities started with no permissions and accumulated only what they needed, reached adoption rates that matched their governance maturity. Those that didn't implement this pattern stayed at 30 to 40% adoption because every expansion of AI capability felt like it was expanding risk. The mechanism for making this work is automation. You can't rely on people to remember that this is how identity should work. You build it into the process. When someone is added to a group, the system automatically provisions the minimum permissions required for that group. When someone leaves the group, those permissions are automatically revoked. When a service principal is created, it's created in a specific environment with specific scopes, not as a blank slate that gets broader permissions over time. Use Entra ID, conditional access, to enforce least privilege across your environment. Use managed identities for applications instead of creating shared service accounts with stored credentials. Use just-in-time elevation for privileged access, where someone can request temporary elevation to perform a specific task and that elevation expires automatically. Don't leave standing elevated permissions. Make privilege something that's requested, approved, used, and then revoked. Here's what's critical. Treat AI agents and service principals exactly the way you'd treat human users. Not as special cases that need different rules, not as infrastructure that sits outside normal governance. The same principles apply. Minimum permissions, short-lived credentials, explicit ownership, clear business justification. When an AI agent is created to handle a specific workflow, that agent gets an identity, just like a user. That identity has permissions scoped to exactly what the agent needs for that workflow. Not everything the agent might theoretically need someday, just what it needs now. If the workflow changes and the agent needs broader access, that's a permission request that goes through review. This matters because it changes how AI adoption scales in your organization. When agents are treated as first-class security principles with the same governance discipline as human identities, scaling from 1 agent to 50 agents doesn't feel like a security risk. It feels like a governed expansion of capability. The agent that's handling customer service gets different permissions than the agent that's handling finance. Conflicts are visible and resolved. Accountability is clear. Organizations that implemented this approach saw 50% fewer security incidents related to identity sprawl or unexpected access patterns. More importantly, they could scale AI adoption faster because the governance foundation was predictable. When you add a new agent, you're not holding your breath hoping it doesn't accidentally access something it shouldn't. You're implementing it with the same rigor you'd use for any new identity entering your environment. The difference between organizations that succeeded and those that stalled at this stage came down to one question. Were identities treated as exceptional cases in your governance model or as standard resources that all follow the same principles? The ones that chose consistency moved faster and with less risk. The data readiness framework, classification and protection. Identity is about who has access. Data readiness is about what they're accessing and whether that access is appropriate. These are different problems with different solutions, but they're interconnected in ways that only become visible when AI starts operating at scale across your tenant. The simulation revealed something consistent across nearly every organization type. Data was scattered everywhere with no consistent classification scheme. Financial records sitting in SharePoint alongside meeting notes. HR documents in Teams channels with broad membership. Customer data in OneDrive with sharing links that had been forwarded to external partners years ago. Intellectual property mixed with routine project work. Nobody had a unified way of saying, this data is sensitive and needs protection, or this data is routine and can be shared openly. Classification sounds like an IT problem. It's not. It's a business problem that IT has to solve technically. You need to answer a fundamental question first. What data actually matters in your organization? Not everything. Specific categories. Financial data, accounts, transactions, forecasts. HR data, employee records, compensation, performance reviews. Customer data, accounts, contracts, communications. Intellectual property, designs, research, source code, trade secrets, legal documents, regulatory requirements. Be specific about what you're trying to protect and why. In the simulation, organizations that skipped this step and tried to protect sensitive data without defining it ran into immediate problems. Everyone had a different idea of what sensitive meant. One team thought financial forecasts needed protection. Another team thought they were routine planning documents. One business unit wanted to lock down customer data. Another thought customer information was marketing collateral that should be widely accessible. Without clear definitions agreed at the business level, technical controls couldn't work. You were trying to protect against a moving target. Once you know what matters, the next step is making those definitions operational. That's where Microsoft Information Protection comes in. Sensitivity labels aren't optional. They're the mechanism that turns a business classification, this is financial data, into a technical control that the system actually enforces. A document gets labeled financial confidential. That label carries rules. The document can't be shared externally without explicit approval. It gets encrypted, it's watermarked, it gets retained for 7 years. The label is the translation layer between business intent and technical enforcement. The key word is automatic. Don't rely on people to remember to apply labels. That's compliance theater. You end up with 10% of your data correctly labeled and 90% that should be labeled but isn't. Use Microsoft's trainable classifiers to automatically detect sensitive content and apply labels. Financial data usually contains account numbers or patterns that machines can detect. HR documents contain names and salary information. Legal documents contain specific language. Let the system find this content and tag it, not because it's perfect, but because it's consistent and scales. Then protection. Labels aren't useful if they're just metadata. They have to drive actual controls. Data loss prevention policies use labels to prevent sensitive data from leaving the organization. Conditional access policies restrict how sensitive data can be accessed. What devices, what locations, what risk levels trigger additional authentication. A document labeled Financial Confidential can be accessed from the Office network with standard authentication. The same document accessed from a home IP address at 2 a.m. triggers additional verification. Not because you're paranoid, because the data matters and access patterns that don't fit the norm are worth questioning. Organizations that implemented classification and protection before scaling AI saw 80% fewer data exposure incidents. They could confidently deploy Copilot because they knew the system wouldn't surface sensitive documents in places they shouldn't be accessible. More importantly, they built confidence internally. Employees understood that sensitive data was actually being protected, not just labeled. Organizations without strong data protection hit compliance crises around month 9. Auditors would ask for sensitive data, and Copilot would surface it from casual conversations. The organization couldn't explain why or how the control failed because there was no control, just undefined sensitivity and hope. By that point, rolling back AI adoption felt necessary, but it didn't solve the underlying problem. The data would still be unclassified and exposed. The organization would just be back to pre-AI friction instead of AI-driven exposure. The critical insight: data classification isn't separate from AI readiness. It's foundational. You cannot safely give an AI system access to your tenant without knowing what data matters and having technical controls in place to protect it. Classification is the prerequisite for everything that comes next. The collaboration readiness framework, lifecycle and ownership. You now have clean identities and classified data, but there's another layer where governance breaks down, and it breaks down because of a feature, not a flaw. Microsoft 365 is built for collaboration velocity. Users need a place to work together. The system lets them create it immediately. A team takes seconds. A SharePoint site is instant. A group is automated. The friction is gone. Work happens at the speed people need. The problem emerges years later when those workspaces are abandoned. In the simulation, I watched this unfold across every organization type. Someone starts a project. They create a workspace. Team members join, work happens, the project wraps up. Or it doesn't, it just loses momentum and gets forgotten. Either way, the workspace remains. Nobody deletes it because there's no deletion process. The owner moves to another role or leaves the company. Nobody recertifies who should own it. The workspace becomes a ghost, technically accessible, still holding data, still consuming quota, but orphaned. The numbers from the simulation were stark. After 2 years, the average organization had accumulated thousands of these abandoned workspaces. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. Each one was a potential data exposure. Each one was a compliance liability. Each one added friction to audits and investigations because auditors had to figure out which workspaces were actually active and which were digital tombs. When AI was introduced, this problem became operational. Copilot indexed the entire tenant, including abandoned workspaces. Users started asking questions like, "Show me everything about the Azure migration project." The AI returned documents from 3 different projects spread across 4 years. One of those projects had an owner who'd been laid off 18 months ago. Nobody thought to revoke access from that workspace. The documents were still there. The permissions were still active. The AI surfaced them at conversational speed, and suddenly a user discovers they have access to sensitive work from initiatives they weren't part of. That discovery cascades. If I can access Azure migration documents from a project I'm not on, what else can I access? The organization gets buried in incidents. Security investigates unusual access patterns. Audit findings spike. By month 6 in the simulation, organizations without workspace lifecycle policies were hemorrhaging. Governance teams were overwhelmed. Incident response was reactive instead of strategic. The pattern was predictable. Proliferation of workspaces, abandonment, AI exposure, incident, over-restriction, productivity, collapse. Organizations caught in this cycle had to choose between 2 bad options: keep the system open and accept the risk, or lock it down and kill velocity. The organizations that avoided this trap did something different. They didn't write a policy saying workspaces expire after 2 years. They automated it. They built standard templates for teams and SharePoint sites that enforce structure from creation. Naming conventions that made workspaces discoverable and understandable. Sensitivity labels applied automatically based on the workspace type and content. Retention policies baked in before the first file was ever uploaded. When you create a workspace from a template, you're not starting from scratch. You're inheriting governance. Then ownership. Every workspace gets a designated owner. Not optional, required. That owner is accountable for the workspace. They decide who should have access. They're responsible for removing people when they leave projects. They make the call on retention and deletion. But more importantly, they're the point of contact if auditors or security need information about the workspace. And critically, expiration. Workspaces don't live forever. They get an expiration date, typically 12 months. As that expiration approaches, the owner has to recertify the workspace, confirm it's still in use, confirm the data still needs to be retained, confirm who should have access. If the owner doesn't recertify, the system archives the workspace automatically. Not deleted, archived. The data is still there if someone needs it, but it's out of the active environment. Organizations that implemented this before scaling AI saw dramatic results. 60% fewer abandoned workspaces, 40% faster AI adoption because teams weren't debating workspace ownership or dealing with unexpected access patterns. More importantly, automated lifecycle management reduced security incidents by 50%. The attack surface shrinks when abandoned workspaces are actually archived instead of sitting there accumulating dust and sensitive data. The operating model requires discipline, but once it's running, the administrative overhead drops dramatically because the system is doing the work, not people. The automation readiness framework, environment separation and control. You now have identity under control, data classified and protected, workspaces with clear ownership and lifecycle. But there's a layer beneath all of this that most organizations don't even treat as governance. It's the automation layer. Power automate flows, logic apps, custom integrations, scheduled jobs. These are critical business infrastructure. They move money. They update records. They trigger workflows that other processes depend on. Yet most organizations treat them like user conveniences instead of production systems. The simulation showed what happens when automation isn't governed. In most of the 100 organizations I ran, Power Automate and logic apps were scattered across the environment with no separation between experimental work and production operations. A business unit needed to pull data from one system and push it to another, so they built a flow. There was no approval process, no testing environment, no separation between dev and production. They built in the default environment, which is where everything experimental and production critical lives together in the same space, completely undifferentiated. These automations weren't toys, they handled real work. A flow in finance pulled data from the ERP system and updated a spreadsheet the CFO used for decisions. A flow in HR automatically processed new hire provisioning. A flow in procurement triggered payment requests, all in the default environment, all with minimal monitoring, all with someone remembering how they worked, but no documentation of what would happen if that person left. When AI agents were introduced, everything changed. An agent needs tools to do its work. One of the natural tools available is exactly what you already built. An agent can invoke those flows just like a human could. Except the agent won't know that the flow is built by someone who's no longer at the company. The agent won't know the flow has never been tested under load. The agent won't know that it's been quietly failing for months and everyone's just working around the failures. Here's where the failure mode becomes visible. An AI agent calls a Power Automate flow with input the flow wasn't built to handle. The flow logic breaks on that unexpected input. The flow fails silently, no alert, no monitoring, nothing. The downstream process that depends on that flow stops working. Someone 3 hours later discovers reconciliation broke. By then, cascading failures have rippled through procurement, finance, and HR. The fix is structural. Treat automation as production code. That means separate environments. Development environment where you experiment. Test environment where you validate changes. Production environment where real flows run against real data. Never run automations against production data in the default environment. Never. Implement change control. Every automation change goes through review before it reaches production. You review the logic. You test against realistic data volumes. You understand the implications. If the flow fails, you can roll back to the previous version. Documentation lives in the flow itself, not in someone's email, so future maintainers understand what it's supposed to do. Implement monitoring. Track when flows execute. Track how long they take. Alert when execution times spike because that usually signals something's wrong. Track failures. When a flow fails, someone needs to know immediately, not hours later when downstream systems are already broken. Monitor for unexpected inputs because that's usually the trigger for cascading failures. Use managed identities. Automations should authenticate using managed identities with scoped permissions, not shared service accounts, with stored credentials passed around in notes or environment variables. When a managed identity is created for an automation, it gets exactly the permissions that automation needs, nothing more. Organizations that implemented this approach saw 70% fewer automation failures. More importantly, they could scale AI adoption without operational chaos because the automation layer was stable and predictable. When an agent called an automation, the organization had confidence the flow would execute reliably or fail in a monitored, recoverable way. Organizations without automation governance reached 20 to 30% adoption. Organizations with strong automation governance reached 70% and beyond. The difference wasn't the features, it was whether automations were treated as critical infrastructure or as side effects. The governance operating model. Clear accountability and decision rights. Frameworks don't work without an operating model. This is the critical distinction that separates organizations that implement governance from organizations that talk about governance. A framework is a structure. These are the 5 readiness domains. This is what success looks like in each one. This is the sequence you should follow. But a framework is inert until someone builds the operating model around it. Someone has to own governance. Someone has to make trade-off decisions when priorities conflict. Someone has to enforce consequences when policies are violated. Without that, frameworks become documents that sit on a server and get referenced during audits, but don't actually drive behavior change. The simulation showed this clearly. Organizations with solid frameworks but no clear operating model stalled. They had identity readiness plans that nobody was accountable for implementing. They had data classification schemes that sounded good in meetings but weren't actually being enforced. They had workspace lifecycle policies that existed on paper but weren't being automatically executed. The frameworks were there, the mechanisms were there. The will to execute them was distributed across so many people that it effectively didn't exist. The fix is an operating model with 3 distinct layers, each with clear accountability. The strategic layer is where governance direction gets set. This is a governance committee that meets quarterly. Include IT leadership, security, compliance, and a business representative from a major stakeholder group. This committee doesn't get bogged down in implementation details. That's not their job. Their job is to set the governance direction for the next quarter or year. They make the big calls. Can external users access our teams? What's our data residency requirement? Which automation tools are approved for business-critical processes? Are we ready to scale AI adoption to new departments? These are policy-level decisions. They require perspective from multiple disciplines. They need business context. They get made here. The tactical layer is where those decisions get translated into reality. This is a governance team. Could be one person in a smaller organization, could be a small team in a larger one. Their job is to take the strategic direction and build it into the actual operating model. The committee says, we're implementing workspace lifecycle policies. The governance team designs the lifecycle rules. They configure the automation. They design the user communication and training. They set up the monitoring to prove it's working. They also handle exceptions and reviews. When someone asks for an exception to a policy, this team reviews it, makes a decision, documents it, and tracks the implications. The operational layer is where governance is enforced continuously without human intervention. This is the automation and monitoring that we've been discussing. Automations that enforce least privilege when new identities are created. Policies that expire workspaces and archive them automatically. Monitoring that alerts when DLP rules are triggered. Continuous access reviews that remove stale permissions. This layer runs constantly. It doesn't require people to remember to do it. The system does it. Here's what makes this model work. There's a single line of accountability. The strategic committee makes decisions. The tactical team executes them and handles exceptions. The operational layer enforces them automatically. When something breaks or needs adjustment, you know exactly where to go. You don't have 5 different teams debating what should happen. You have one team that was chartered to make that decision. Organizations that structured governance this way reached adoption rates that matched their investment. They reached 70% adoption and saw measurable ROI. They could move forward. When a new AI capability became available, they could evaluate it, decide yes or no, and implement it without the organization getting stuck in endless alignment discussions. Organizations that never established clear operating models stayed stuck. They had all the right frameworks. They just couldn't execute them because decision authority was diffuse. Nobody owned the outcome. Everyone had a voice. Nothing had momentum. The simulation revealed that governance ownership was the single biggest predictor of AI adoption success. Budget mattered less. Tool sophistication mattered less. Skill level mattered less. The one thing that predicted success more than anything else was whether you had a clear, accountable structure that made governance decisions and enforced them continuously. Measuring governance maturity from theater to reality. You can't improve what you don't measure. This is a truism in business, and it's brutally true in governance. But most organizations measure the wrong things. Ask any IT leader how AI adoption is going, and they'll tell you the seat count. We've provisioned 5,000 licenses. That's not adoption, that's procurement. Real adoption is behavioral. It's whether people are actually using the system. It's whether they're coming back. It's whether it's delivering business value. The simulation revealed something stark about measurement discipline. The metric you choose becomes the behavior you reinforce. Organizations that measured adoption by license count got a result. Seat count went up. Users got access, then most of them never used it again. The metric succeeded, the adoption failed. Real success metrics are behavioral, not transactional, and they break into 3 categories that matter. The first is adoption depth, not whether users have access, whether they're actually using it weekly. The simulation showed that only 35% of organizations hit 70% or higher weekly active usage rates. Those that did saw 3 times better ROI than organizations where users tried the system once and moved on. This matters because a user who touches the system weekly is learning, building habits, finding use cases. A user who logs in once and forgets about it has made a decision. This isn't valuable enough to come back to. That decision is silent, but it's real. The difference between shallow adoption and deep adoption is the difference between a failed investment and a successful one. So measure weekly active usage, not daily, not monthly. Weekly. That's the cadence that tells you whether the system is becoming part of how people work. The second metric is retention. Are users coming back? The simulation showed that organizations with strong governance saw 80% month-over-month retention. New users start using the system 1 month and 80% of them are still using it the next month. Organizations without governance saw 40% retention. 50-50 users drop off the moment they hit friction. That's not adoption friction, that's governance friction. When users hit the system and discover they can't access what they need because permissions are wrong, or they hit an automation that's broken because it wasn't monitored, or they discover their workspace expired and the data's gone, they leave. Retention tracks whether the system is stable enough and well-governed enough to build habit. The third metric is business outcome. Is it actually delivering value? The simulation showed that organizations measuring time saved, error reduction, or cycle time improvement saw 2 to 4 times ROI in the first year. These are concrete metrics. How long did this task take before? How long does it take now? What's the difference? Multiplied across the organization, converted to dollars? That's your business case. Measure it, track it, use it to justify continued investment or to diagnose what's broken if the value isn't there. But measurement gets a third layer, governance maturity metrics. How many identity reviews are you actually completing on schedule? What percentage of automations in your environment have active monitoring? How long does it take from detecting a policy violation to actually remediating it? These are hygiene metrics. They tell you whether your governance frameworks are operating or whether they're sitting inert. Organizations that track these metrics aggressively optimize continuously. They saw what wasn't working, adjusted, measured again, got better. Those that didn't measure stalled at 30 to 40% adoption. They had no way to diagnose why adoption was failing, so they couldn't fix it. Here's what made this critical in the simulation. Measurement discipline was the second biggest predictor of adoption success, right after governance ownership. More important than budget, more important than tool sophistication. The organizations that succeeded were the ones that said, we're going to know whether this is working and we're going to adjust based on what we learn. This requires infrastructure. You need dashboards that show adoption depth, retention, and business value. You need automated collection of governance health metrics. You need a cadence for reviewing these metrics and deciding what to optimize next. It's not complicated infrastructure. It's just discipline about measuring what matters and ignoring what doesn't. Most organizations skip this step. They implement frameworks and hope for the best. The best performers don't hope, they measure. The adoption sequence. Start with identity, end with intelligence. You now understand the 5 failure patterns. You know the 5 frameworks. You know the operating model. The question that matters most is the one every organization asks. Where do we actually start? This is where sequence becomes critical. The simulation revealed something that might seem obvious in hindsight, but runs counter to how most organizations actually operate. You cannot do all 5 frameworks simultaneously. Organizations that tried, that said, we're going to clean up identity, classify data, implement lifecycle policies, govern automation, and establish clear operating models all at the same time, failed spectacularly. They ran out of focus, they ran out of resources, they ran out of momentum. By month 4, everything was stalled, nothing was finished, nothing was working. Organizations that sequenced carefully succeeded. They picked one framework, executed it completely, stabilized it, then moved to the next. The sequence matters because each layer builds on the previous one. You cannot effectively classify data when you don't know who has access to it. You cannot build a collaboration model that works when identity is a mess. You cannot scale automation safely without reliable data governance underneath it. The proven sequence is this: identity, then data, then collaboration, then automation, then intelligence. Start with identity. Give yourself 3 months. Enumerate every identity in your tenant. Understand the permission topology. Remove stale accounts. Implement least privilege for new identities going forward. Establish clear ownership. This is the foundation. Do not skip it. Do not rush it. If you're not confident in your identity layer after 3 months, you haven't finished. Extend it. Better to spend 4 months on identity than to build everything else on a broken foundation. Once identity is solid, move to data. Another 3 months. Define what data matters in your organization. Build a classification scheme that your business understands. Implement sensitivity labels. Make labeling automatic where possible. Layer in DLP policies. Connect those labels to actual technical controls. This is where you establish the rules of the road for what data AI can ultimately see. 3 months in, you move to collaboration. Implement workspace lifecycle policies, assign clear ownership, set expiration dates, automate the creation process so new workspaces start with the right sensitivity labels and retention rules. This is where you establish the boundaries of where work happens. Then automation. 2 months for this one. You're not starting from zero. You already have automations scattered across your tenant. Inventory them, move them to proper environments, implement monitoring, establish change control, test, document. This is where you establish reliability for automated workflows. Only after you've done all 4 do you introduce intelligence. This is the critical part. Do not introduce AI before you've completed the sequence. Start with read-only scenarios. Copilot for search, Copilot for summarization. Let it run on top of your clean identity, classified data, managed collaboration, and reliable automation. Watch what happens. Measure, adjust. Only after you've proven the governance works at read-only do you expand to write scenarios, automations, agents, systems that actually modify data or trigger processes. This sequencing takes 12 to 15 months. It's not fast. Organizations moving faster than this in the simulation invariably hit walls around month 6 or 9 when the shortcuts caught up with them. But here's what happened to organizations that followed the sequence. They reached 70% or higher adoption after 15 months. More importantly, that adoption was stable. They weren't spending 50% of their time putting out fires. They were spending their time expanding capability and delivering business value. Organizations that didn't sequence carefully stalled at 20 to 30% adoption after the same 12 months. They tried to do everything at once. Nothing was finished. Nothing worked reliably. They were too buried in crisis management to move forward. The difference wasn't intelligence or effort or budget, it was patience and discipline about building one layer completely before moving to the next. The governance resistance. Why organizations choose theater over reality. Here's the thing, nobody wants to admit about the 5 patterns we just covered. Organizations don't fail to implement them because they lack competence or resources. They fail because governance is profoundly boring and innovation is exciting. Governance doesn't appear in earnings calls. It doesn't move stock price. It doesn't get you a promotion, it gets you a reputation for slowing things down. The simulation revealed what I call the velocity trap. Organizations faced with a choice, invest 6 months building governance foundations or buy licenses and show adoption numbers next quarter, consistently choose the latter. The math feels obvious. Show momentum now, deal with consequences later. In month 1 and 2, this strategy feels brilliant. The adoption numbers climb. Executives see the progress they wanted. Teams are excited. The innovation narrative writes itself. You're moving fast. You're getting things done. Then month 6 arrives. The identity sprawl that nobody cleaned up becomes an incident. A critical automation fails because nobody separated dev from production. A user discovers they can access data from a team they never joined. Security runs a test and surfaces confidential information through Copilot that should never have been accessible. The organization hits the wall, but by this point, momentum has carried you too far. There's political capital in the program. There's a team built around the initiative. Admission that the foundation is broken feels like failure. Month 9 gets worse. Audit finds the sensitivity labels you wrote down were never actually applied to documents. The retention policies exist on paper but weren't deployed to the tenant. The DLP rules you configured aren't being monitored. The organization that felt like it was winning suddenly looks like it was pretending to win. Trust evaporates. Stakeholders who were excited become skeptical. The program that was supposed to deliver innovation starts looking like a liability. By month 12, the pendulum swings hard. The organization that said move fast and iterate swings to lock everything down. Self-service gets killed. Approvals become required for everything. Velocity becomes glacial. Users stop asking for new capabilities because the answer is always no. The AI adoption that was supposed to drive productivity becomes a cautionary tale about why new technology is risky. The simulation showed that organizations without discipline go through this cycle 2 or 3 times before finally getting serious. They learn this lesson the hard way. Fast and risky fails, lockdown fails, so eventually they settle into something in the middle that actually works. But they've burned time, budget, credibility, and teams in the process. The cost of cycling through this pattern multiple times is enormous. Wasted licenses sit on accounts that stopped using the system. Incident response consumes resources that could have gone to expansion. Teams get burned out by the constant firefighting. The organization's reputation as a competent AI adopter is damaged. When you ask a business unit, should we try this new capability? They remember the last time things fell apart and say no. Here's where the insight shifts from diagnosis to strategy. The organizations that escaped this cycle didn't do it by choosing between speed or safety. They did it by reframing what governance actually is. When governance is positioned as preventing risk or slowing us down, it becomes something to minimize or work around. When governance is positioned as enabling innovation at scale, it becomes something to invest in. The difference isn't in the policies, it's in the framing. The most successful organizations in the simulation treated governance not as a constraint on their ambitions, but as the system that made their ambitions achievable. Think about it differently. Identity cleanup isn't about restriction. It's about confidence that when you add a new employee and grant them access, you know exactly what they can do. Data classification isn't about locking data away. It's about knowing that when you deploy Copilot, it will surface relevant information safely. Automation governance isn't about red tape. It's about reliability that your workflows won't fail in unexpected ways when scale increases. Organizations that framed governance as enablement got faster executive buy-in and better outcomes. They built momentum not around adoption numbers, but around capability expansion. They could move forward because the foundation was reliable. The governance resistance is real. It's human, it's organizational, but it's also solvable the moment you stop treating governance as overhead and start treating it as strategy. The unified model, how governance enables AI at scale. Let me tie together what the 100 simulations revealed about the relationship between governance and innovation, because this is where the entire framework inverts from how most organizations think about it. The 5 failure patterns we've covered aren't independent problems. They're symptoms of a single underlying misalignment. Organizations treat governance as something that gets in the way of what they actually want to do. Governance is friction. Governance is overhead. Governance is what the security team insists on while business units want to move fast. The assumption is that less governance means faster innovation. That's backwards. Here's what the simulation showed. In reality, strong governance enables faster innovation, not slower, faster. When you have clean identities, you stop spending time troubleshooting unexpected access. When you have classified data, you stop second-guessing what can be shared where. When you have reliable automation, you stop firefighting cascading failures. The organization that moves fastest isn't the one with zero governance. It's the one where governance is predictable and automated enough that it gets out of the way and lets people do their jobs. The simulation measured this directly. Organizations with strong governance across all 5 readiness domains reached 70% or higher adoption rates and saw measurable return on investment. Their cost per user was lower because they weren't spending money on incident response. Their time to value was faster because they weren't stuck waiting for approvals or investigating unexpected security issues. Organizations without governance discipline stayed at 20 to 30% adoption and saw negative ROI from wasted licenses and the constant firefighting that absorbed every resource that should have gone to expansion. This is the unified model. Governance isn't about saying no. It's about saying yes, but within these boundaries. The boundaries aren't restrictions. They're enablers. They're how you move fast without destroying things. Think about identity. When your identity layer is clean and you've implemented least privilege, you can confidently delegate access. A manager can request broader permissions for a team member and trust that the request goes through a reliable process and the permissions get applied correctly. They can confidently share information because they know exactly who has access. That confidence is what enables velocity. Data readiness works the same way. When data is classified and protection policies are actually enforced, you can confidently share sensitive information with teams that need it. You're not overthinking what's safe to send. The system is handling that for you. Confidence, that's the enabler. Automation governance gives you reliable orchestration. When your automations are separated into proper environments and monitored continuously, you can build on top of them without fear. You can compose multiple automations together because you have confidence they'll execute reliably or fail in a way you can observe and recover from. AI agents amplify all of this. A well-governed organization can deploy agents with confidence because the foundation is solid. The agent operates within clean identity boundaries. It accesses classified data appropriately. It calls reliable automations. It can do meaningful work without the organization holding its breath, waiting for something to break. An ungoverned organization deploying agents is essentially allowing those agents to expose every weakness in the system simultaneously. That's not innovation, that's a stress test that breaks things. Here's the shift in thinking that separates organizations that succeed from those that cycle through boom-bust patterns. The successful organizations don't treat governance as a project that ends. They treat it as a continuous operating system. They measure it, they optimize it, they evolve it as the organization changes and as new risks emerge. Governance isn't something you do once and then declare victory. It's something you build into the way the organization operates and then get better at over time. This is why the simulation revealed such a stark difference in outcomes. Organizations that built strong governance and then maintained it continuously reached sustainable high adoption. Organizations that cycle between move fast and break things and lock everything down never escape the pattern. The middle ground, governance as a foundation that enables instead of restricts, is where success lives. What this means for your organization, the 90-day readiness assessment. This is the moment where theory meets practice. You now understand why the patterns emerge. You know what the frameworks look like. You understand the sequence that works. The question that actually matters is where your organization stands right now and what you should do about it. The simulation revealed something useful here. There's a 90-day assessment that predicts adoption success with 85% accuracy. It's not complicated, it doesn't require consultants or months of audit work. It's a straightforward diagnostic that tells you where the foundation is solid and where it's broken. You're going to score 5 domains. Each one gets a 0 to 3 rating based on realistic criteria. Your total possible score is 15. That number tells you a lot about what's going to happen when you scale AI adoption. Start with identity readiness. Ask yourself, can you enumerate every identity in your tenant right now? Do you have a current process for identifying and removing stale accounts? Are you actually implementing least privilege policies when new identities are created, or are you still doing the old pattern of broad permissions that get trimmed later? Are service principals and application accounts owned and tracked, or are they scattered across the environment? Score yourself 0 to 3 based on honest answers. 0 means you have no idea how many identities exist. 3 means you have documented ownership, active removal processes, and least privilege is the default. Data readiness is the second domain. Do you have a clear classification scheme that your business can explain, not just IT? Are sensitivity labels actually deployed and being applied automatically, or do they exist in documentation but not in practice? Are DLP policies configured and monitored, or just turned on and forgotten? Is data protection actually enforced, or is it theater? Again, 0 to 3. 0 means you have no classification system. 3 means classification is automated, labels are consistently applied, and protection policies are actively monitored. Collaboration readiness looks at workspace governance. Do you have lifecycle policies that actually expire workspaces? Are workspaces required to have clear owners, and are those ownerships being recertified? Are you archiving abandoned workspaces or just letting them pile up? The scoring is straightforward. 0 is no lifecycle management. 3 is fully automated with clear ownership and active archival. Automation readiness is about your flow and integration layer. Do you have environment separation between development and production? Is change control actually enforced on automations, or do people push changes to production directly? Do you monitor automation failures and unexpected patterns? Are managed identities in use, or are you still using stored credentials? 0 means no separation, no monitoring, no controls. 3 means everything is separated, monitored, documented, and controlled. The fifth domain is governance readiness. Is there a single person or small team accountable for governance decisions? Does a governance committee actually meet and set policy direction? Are you measuring governance health metrics, completion rates on reviews, policy violation response times, that kind of thing? Or are governance metrics something that exists in theory only? 0 is no governance owner and no accountability. 3 is clear ownership, active committee, and measured outcomes. Add those 5 numbers together, that's your score out of 15. Here's what the simulation showed. Organizations that scored 12 to 15 reached 70% or higher adoption and saw measurable return on investment. They could move forward. They had the foundation to scale. Organizations scoring 9 to 11 reached 40 to 50% adoption. They moved faster than organizations with broken foundations, but slower than those with solid ones. Organizations scoring below 9 stayed stuck at 20 to 30% adoption. They had too many fires to put out. The other finding was equally important. Organizations improved their score by 3 to 4 points in 90 days when they focused effort, not in 6 months, not eventually, in 90 days. Because the framework isn't about building something from nothing. It's about using discipline to complete what's partially there. Your next step is straightforward. Run this assessment for your organization. Be honest about the scoring. Don't give yourself credit for things that exist on paper but aren't actually working. Take that score and identify which domain is weakest. That's where you start. If identity is 3 and automation is 0, you start with automation. You sequence your work based on the diagnostic, not on what sounds important. The choice is yours. The 100 simulations converged on a single insight that cuts through all the complexity of M365 governance and AI adoption. The organizations that succeeded weren't the ones with the biggest budgets or the fanciest tools. They were the ones that made a deliberate choice about what they were willing to invest in before they invested in AI itself. That choice is now in front of you. You can continue with the pattern most organizations follow. License Copilot broadly. Declare an AI adoption initiative. Show momentum through seat count and pilot stories. Feel the initial excitement as users discover new capabilities. Then encounter the failures we've mapped across 1,000 simulations. The failures aren't random, they're structural. They happen in the same sequence at the same points because they emerge from the same root causes. Identity sprawl exposes access you didn't know existed. Abandoned workspaces become data liabilities the moment AI surfaces their content. Automations fail under load because they were never built for production. Governance frameworks that looked solid on paper provide no actual protection when tested. The moment of crisis arrives around month 6, month 9, or month 12, depending on your starting point, and by then, the organization is already committed to the program. Rolling back feels like admitting failure. Moving forward feels impossible. Or you can make a different choice, one that the simulation showed works consistently across organization types, industries, and governance starting points. The choice to invest in foundation before you invest in capability. The choice to move deliberately through identity, data, collaboration, automation, and finally intelligence instead of trying to do everything simultaneously. The choice to treat governance as strategy instead of overhead. The choice to accept that sustainable adoption takes 12 to 15 months instead of trying to force results in 3. This isn't a choice between speed and safety. It's a choice about what actual speed looks like. The organizations that built strong governance reached meaningful adoption faster than those that skipped it because they weren't constantly stopping to address fires that the shortcuts created. They moved at a different pace, slower initially, much faster over time. That's the pattern the simulation revealed consistently. Here's what matters right now. You know the patterns, you know the frameworks, you know the sequence, you know the 90-day assessment that predicts whether you'll succeed. You have the roadmap. The question is whether you're going to follow it or whether you'll take the path that 70% of organizations take. the one that looks faster initially but leads to the same wall. Your first action is mechanical but critical. Run the 90-day readiness assessment. Find the domain where you score lowest. That's where you start, not where you want to start, not where you think will show the most visible progress, where you actually need to start. If that's identity, you spend the next 3 months on identity. You don't touch the other frameworks until that one is solid. This requires discipline because other stakeholders will push for visible progress in other areas. You'll feel pressure to just get something working. You'll hear, this governance stuff can wait. The organizations in the simulation that resisted that pressure succeeded. The ones that tried to do everything at once failed. When you've completed identity, move to data. 3 months, then collaboration. 3 months, then automation. 2 months. Only then do you introduce AI into the broader organization. Read only first, measure, adjust, then expand. This timeline is 12 to 15 months from start to meaningful adoption. It's not fast, it's proven. Share this framework with the people who need to execute it. Your governance owner, your IT leadership, your security team. This is their roadmap. They need to see that it's sequenced, measured, and based on 1,000 simulated iterations across realistic organizational models. Not someone's opinion about how governance should work. Evidence about how it actually works. If you want to go deeper, I've created detailed resources that walk through each framework. The identity cleanup process, the data classification implementation, the collaboration lifecycle automation, the automation governance patterns, the operating model structure. Connect with me on LinkedIn and I'll share them. I'm reading every message. Subscribe to the M365 FM podcast if you haven't already. Every episode delivers research-backed insight into Microsoft 365, Copilot, Azure, security, governance, and the modern workplace. This kind of practical, structural thinking is what the show is built on. Leave a review. It helps more architects and decision makers find this content. And remember this, the future of AI in your organization isn't determined by the technology, it's determined by the governance model you build today. The technology will change, Copilot will evolve, new agents and capabilities will emerge. But the fundamental question of whether your organization can adopt them safely and sustainably comes down to the structure you build. Make the choice that the simulation proved works. Build the foundation, then scale the capability. Your organization's AI future starts with governance, not with licensing. Make that choice deliberately, and you'll be part of the 30% that succeeds.